My experience learning English. The stage that I started to learn the language was when I studied at private language school. I started to understand the language from the basic form, meaning, and use. I remember that when I was at level 11, we saw phrasal verbs. The teacher gave us a list full of them and asked us to memorize them and explain us that phrasal verbs are verbs composed of a particle that can be before or after a verb, and that depending on that place of that particle, the meaning of the verb changes completely from its basic form. Where did I find problems? Well, as a result, I was astonished, surprised, and shocked. I could not understand how to use them because in my mind, the verbs and prepositions or some adverbs had a specific meaning, and that was all. I have no idea. So I tried to associate their meaning and structure with something from previous levels or structure from my mother tongue. But of course it didn't work because I have no previous reference. So I would say that that level was very difficult to me. Uh, Even though the teacher was very good teacher, she uses many strategies, sources, different approaches to ensure our comprehension of that structure. What did I do and what I have to do? The only strategy that worked for me was using the phrasal verbs in a natural environment. I remember that when I started to talking with other people on real life, I noticed the how to use them. So speaking and listening was useful for me. Doing associations with their form and meaning, but I have to recognize that I was not able to achieve the proficiency level at that moment of writing or reading. That was very difficult for me. Despite this, I have not mastered the use of the phrasal verbs, of course. In consequence, sometimes I avoid the topic in my lessons. However, it is an opportunity for me to improve and teach this part of the language to my students. Correspondences between English and Spanish. Phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs correspond to category 3. I did this classification because they do not exist in the Spanish language. Their structure, meaning, and use have no reference, match, or resemble in Spanish. Uh, they have three different categories that are defined by the function, and relationship of the verb and the particle. And they are classified on prepositional verbs. They're also called non-separal verbs. The separal transitive phrasal verbs that take the direct object, and separal intransitive phrasal verbs that do not take a direct object. And finally, there is a classification that is prepositional phrasal verbs, which are also called phrasal prepositional verbs, or three words. Contrastive analysis. Here I'm going to start explaining the classification, analysis that I have done. First, talking about a classification done by Dowd and Loeffler on 1985. I chose this classification because it helps me to understand better why there are no correspondences between phrasal verbs in English and any feature of in Spanish. Um, well, the first classification is literal or transparent phrasal verbs whose meaning equals or is equals to the meaning of their individual components. For example, these verbs correspond to intransitive phrasal verbs. Go up is formed by go plus up, and in this case, its translation or association seems similar to ir arriba in Spanish if we separate the verbs. However, when the phrasal verb is used in a context where there is no reference, for example, we like to see the baby's weight going steadily up, not equal, nos gustaría ver que el peso del bebé yendo constantemente arriba. There is no reference, even the translation is not correct, of course, it's only for an example. and it's evidence that why this phrasal verbs corresponds to classification number 3. Continuing with the analysis, the contrastive analysis, the other classification is completive phrasal verbs, in which the particle describes the final result of the action and just indicates that the action has been done completely. They can be considered as a subtype of transparent phrasal verbs since the particle adds a completion meaning. The meaning of the phrasal verb will coincide with the actual meaning of the verb ahead. For example, cut off. It corresponds to a separable transitive phrasal verb that means cut something completely. In Spanish, we don't say cortar fuera, of course. In a sentence, the contrast is evident. Cut the top of the carrots, no equal cortar la parte superior fuera de las zanahorias. Those examples in Spanish are only as a reference because there are no any correspondence. The third classification is figurative phrasal verbs, whose meaning cannot be deduced even if you know the meaning of its components. It is the highest level of difficulty because you cannot infer the meaning of the verb with the components. So the new meaning is the result of a metaphorical shift of the individual components. For example, carry off. It means win a prize. For example, in Spanish, carry is llevar plus of fuera, llevar fuera. Of course, there is no any sense with these verbs or association with any vocabulary part of or language structure in Spanish. So it also gives me the evidence that the classification of this part of the language, phrasal verbs, corresponds to number 3. Finally, I would like to share my conclusions. This classification helps me to understand why it's even more difficult to learn and understand phrasal verbs. Also, I can use this method, this classification, to improve my pedagogical practice, my teaching practice, in order to help my learners to understand this part of the language. The comparison and contrast analysis classify the phrasal verbs in category number 3. This is the result of the analysis, which means there is a big difference, and as is bigger the difference, the level is higher. It's more difficult. According to Irene Cristobal Garcia, 2014, on her study of English phrasal verbs in the production of L2 learners, this study was called Are Phrasal Verbs That Difficult for L1 Spanish Speakers? The reasons that she mentions for this classification and the difficulties that Spanish speakers have with English phrasal verbs are number one, the grammatical properties of English, the phrasal verbs, the lack of phrasal verbs in Spanish. This is something that calls our attention and give me more evidence of the classification, of course, and the actual use they make of phrasal verbs. This is more related with the practice of the learning or acquisition of the language. Finally, the type of instructions the students receive on phrasal verbs is more related with teaching strategies. But no, those are the conclusions for this analysis. Thank you so much.